Hello, everyone. Good evening. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Alexander Wolff. Feel free to type questions for Alexander into the chat at the bottom of your screen, as there will be a brief Q&A following the talk. Alex Wolff did his undergraduate work at Princeton, where he majored in history. Soon after he graduated, he began a very successful 36-year career at Sports Illustrated magazine. I have been a subscriber to SI for nearly 60 years, and I was a big fan of Alex's before I ever met him. He is a terrific writer. In addition to penning his regular articles for SI, he found time to publish a number of books, including The Audacity of Hoop, Basketball in the Age of Obama, the New York Times bestseller Raw Recruits, and Big Game, Small World, a basketball adventure, which was named a New York Times notable book. Tonight, Alex is going to talk about his most recent book, Endpapers, a family story of books, war, escape, and home. It is fascinating, beautifully written, and it has been very well received. For example, Joshua Hammer, who reviewed Endpapers in the New York Review of Books, declared, "Revelatory, riveting, and deeply moving, Endpapers is a kind of reckoning, an exploration of the author's family's bargains with the Nazis, a reflection on inherited guilt and its imperatives, and a contemplation of the ways the post-war Germans have attempted to expiate the horrific deeds and moral blindness of their elders." Another reviewer wrote, "Meticulously researched and beautifully written, Endpapers at its heart is an absorbing family history. But it is so much more than that. It is a haunting exploration of guilt and responsibility, of roots and new beginnings, filled with stunning literary details that any bibliophile will cherish. This is an intimate and complex portrait of a remarkable family that also tells a wider story of European and American in the 20th century. Endpapers is a treasure, a brave and moving book." I have had the very good fortune to come to know Alex through more or less regular weekly lunches during the last 2 summers with him, Carl Lindholm, and Rick Hawley on the deck at Mr. Up's. I have learned that Alex Wolff is not only a most knowledgeable sports buff, but also a bright, witty, and empathetic person. Not only do I think you will like his book, you will certainly like Alexander Wolff. And now, direct from his lovely farmhouse in nearby Cornwall, Vermont, where Alex resides with his wife Vanessa and their children Clara and Frank, who is a first-year student at the University of Michigan, please give a big virtual welcome to Alexander Wolff.
Thank you so much, David. Real quick, I really appreciate the remarks. I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity to speak to the members, trustees, supporters, staff of the Sheldon. Thank you so much. I just want to let the record reflect, as I don my Michigan hat here, as David was wearing his, that it's our daughter Clara, not our son Frank, who is the first year. But be that as it may. Thank you so much. I cannot tell you how exciting it is to be able to talk about the process of writing this book to this particular audience. And because you are who you are, you love history, yes, go blue. Thank you, Robert Black. Because you love history, like me, your heart races when you walk into an archive or a folder that hasn't been cracked open for 2 decades gets thumped on a table in front of you. I'm just going to geek out a little bit, I think, and share just a little more than I would ordinarily share about the process. Can I go to screen share here, Taylor? I think I can.
Yep, you should be able to.
Okay, I will do that right now. And I do have a very brief video to share. For those of you who have not picked up the book and may not completely understand it, it's maybe 3 or 4 minutes, and it will give you a sense of what to expect. So here goes.
That face that is usually covered by her phone has finally made an appearance. That face wouldn't be doing that if you weren't staying.
Thank you for indulging 5 seconds of ads. As an epigraph to the book, I chose a passage from the German novelist W.G. Sebald, in part because it tells of a child asking a question of an elder. Once the snow completely blankets the ground, how can the squirrels tell where they've buried their food? It's a question that leads us to consider what we know and how we remember, and what it is we find in the end. Endpapers is a book about books. It's also about my grandfather Kurt, my father Nico, and me. And it's about war and escape and facing up to the past and how a fractured family finds its way home. My grandfather Kurt Wolff grew up in the Germany of the Kaiser, in a musical family with Jewish roots, before marrying my grandmother, an heiress to the Merck pharmaceutical empire. Several years later, he had founded the firm that published the work of such literary titans as Franz Kafka. But my father Nico Wolff was born in 1921 into a Germany forever changed by World War I. Germans would soon lose their appetite for books and music and art, turning instead toward the ravings of Adolf Hitler. By the late 20s, Kurt had dissolved his business. A few years later, he and my grandmother divorced, leaving Nico and his sister with their non-Jewish mother. In 1933, the Nazis seized power. Within hours after the Reichstag burned, Kurt had fled Berlin. Through the remainder of the 30s, my father and aunt would visit him in his refugee haunts around Europe. And then, with the Third Reich about to turn the continent into a killing field, the paths of my father and grandfather diverged. Kurt fled Italy, then France, before escaping through Portugal to New York in 1941. Nico was drafted into the Wehrmacht and served Hitler on two fronts. Nico, captured after the Battle of the Bulge, landed in an American POW camp. Kurt, after founding Pantheon Books in Manhattan, was finally able to get my father to the US in 1948. I moved to Berlin for a year to untangle the story, to immerse myself in letters and archives, and chase down relatives, known and unknown, to do what Germans of my generation had done long ago, but which I, as an American raised by an immigrant father who chose not to look back, never thought to do, to examine my ancestors' relationship to National Socialism. Berlin has been called the trustee of German history, which has left its scars here as nowhere else. I went there to run my finger over those scars, to measure the length of each cut and feel the thickness of the tissue. Endpapers is history, journalism, and memoir, folded around the journeys of two German-born men turned American citizens, each caught up in the drama of the 20th century. So thank you for bearing with me on that. Those of you who haven't read the book, I hope it gives you a little flavor for what it is that I ultimately was able to produce in terms of a book. But that process was long and arduous, and so long and arduous that I probably began to take notes for it maybe way back in the late 80s or early 90s. Just scribbled sometimes on scraps of paper and threw them into a folder. Over the years, my dad had told me this or that about what it had been like in the Ukraine, about his trip over to the United States, arriving on a Friday the 13th in August 1948. And then those of you who read the book know there was an entire chapter devoted to a cruise down the Danube that I took with my father in the summer of 1996. And it was there that I scribbled in this very notebook. We would have a lunch and go back to our cabin, and I would throw questions at him. It was my first real chance to interrogate him, I guess might be too strong a word, because I wasn't on any kind of crusade to find the truth at that point, but at least throw questions his way and have him reminisce. And I still remember at one point during that cruise, he turned to me and said, maybe you'll write about this someday. And, sometimes hearing permission rattling around in your head from a parent can be very comforting as one gets later on into the process and they're gone. And as a journalist, I've also taken this bit of advice to heart. Write it down, always write it down, that when some insight, some phrase, whatever it might be, occurs to you, to tell yourself that you'll remember it is the whisper of the devil. You won't unless you write it down in the moment, or at least that's been my experience. So after my dad died in 2007, my sisters and I took receipt of all sorts of material. I happen to come from a family of writers and pack rats. The combination is lethal sometimes, but in my case, it was a blessing. So my dad wrote faithfully home to his mother back in Munich during the war, and she, being a pack rat, kept everyone and returned it to the actual envelope in which it came, which has not just postmarks, but the places that everything was posted and the date. So I could recreate my father's movements through the course of the war based on these letters he sent home. So this was an incredibly valuable starting point. My dad, who considered becoming an architect, has really lovely handwriting, and it's quite decipherable. So while my German sometimes needed some help, which I'll get to a little bit later, riddling out the words in these letters was not difficult. And those of you who spend any time with German script know that is not always the case. There were also boxes and folders of documents, things that my father had never talked about. He had to fill out after the war a questionnaire, a denazification questionnaire that had more than 100 questions on it, that asked all sorts of queries about political affiliation and so forth. Now, the denazification process wound up becoming basically a farce, because who was held to account and who wasn't held to account bore no reality to what had actually been done during the war. And there were all sorts of ways people got off the hook, wriggled off the hook, or had favors done for them. But if my father was going to emigrate to the States in 1948, this paperwork had to be tended to. And then he was also a very avid amateur photographer. This photograph, which was in an album that I discovered in the back of a closet literally 2 or 3 weeks before the book was going to press, my dad took in August of 1936, I believe. He just turned 15, and he and his mother were taking an automobile tour around Germany at the time, and this was in Lübeck in northern Germany. In the book, it's reproduced honing in on the top quadrant to the left there. That includes the black cat and the Nazi banners and that pedestrian who has a vaguely Franz Kafkaesque look to him. But I like the composition of the full one, where you can see my dad's shadow in the foreground and all the lines kind of converge in that upper left-hand quadrant. But in any case, aside from this photo, which is so dramatic, there were a lot of other more quotidian photos and even a few watercolors that he did while he was serving the Reich. So beyond going through these personal and family letters and diary entries and appointment books, I also dove into the archives. I think next year, I believe Taylor told me it'll be the 50th anniversary of the Sheldon archives. So you are listening tonight to somebody who has just enormous respect for archives. And there was a genealogical essay that an aunt of mine had written about my great-grandmother, Kurt Wolff's mother, Maria, who was the Jewish ancestor of his. And in that, she talks about one of Maria's ancestors, Moritz von Haber, who's pictured here. Now, Moritz was, of course, of Jewish descent. His father, Solomon, was a practicing Jew at the time. Moritz converted, but Solomon was actually the court banker for the Grand Duke of Baden. So a very prominent guy. Actually, because of his service to the Grand Duchy, he was given that noble title, von, by the very grateful Grand Duke. What I discovered, and never heard from any family member, had no idea about this, and it was only this reference that my aunt made in this genealogical essay to Moritz von Haber, a rake, adventurer, womanizer, and duelist, that sent me down a rabbit hole. And it found out that not only had his father Solomon been chased from his home in Karlsruhe by an anti-Semitic mob, but 23 years after that, in another round of anti-Semitic rioting, Moritz himself, then in that same home, had been chased from it. So this was pretty sobering, and sets the stage, certainly for me, to begin to understand how by the mid to late 18th century, anti-Semitism in Germany was already well established. And the city archive in Karlsruhe had all sorts of material about the Haber affair, where Moritz was challenged to a duel by Christian army officers and felt that his honor had been besmirched. So counter-challenged, and was told that, but you're a Jew, you're not worthy of satisfaction in a duel. Well, things did change, and there were 2 people dead at the end of these 2 duels, and Moritz survived and lived to the ripe old age of somewhere into his 80s. There was also an archive in Marbach near Stuttgart, the German Literary Archive, where I found beautifully Typescript by Kurt Wolff's secretary, Frau Herrlein, this World War I diary he kept as a young army officer stationed in the Balkans and in Belgium and so forth. And I cannot tell you how much of a break it was that it was actually a Typescript and not still scribbled out in longhand. I had much better chance of making sense of it. And also early in the book, it's a great chance to introduce Kurt as a character, because like so many Germans at the beginning of World War I, he goes off to war believing that this will be short, it will be sweet, Germany will be united by this great militaristic adventure. And very quickly, you see in the diary his disillusionment. And in the excerpts that I use in the book, I try to track that turn in his attitude and how he ultimately becomes a militant pacifist, if that's not an oxymoron. And finally, this archive in Berlin, the Bundesarchiv, there's a remarkable backstory to this. So in April of 1945, American forces are closing in on Munich from the west. And the Nazi higher-ups realize that the end game is here. So there's a paper mill on the outskirts of Munich where a Nazi party functionary shows up and says, you're going to get a succession of deliveries of paper that will be bundled and you are to pulp it all. And the foreman at this paper factory is delighted because there are these horrible wartime shortages. And he's thinking, oh, this is great. I'll have a lot more pulp with which to make new paper. So sure enough, these trucks arrive with all these bundles of paper, and he starts stacking them up in the corner of the yard. And his curiosity gets the better of him, and he examines one of the bales and realizes these are the Nazi Party membership records. And it so happens that this foreman is an anti-Nazi of great fervor. So he starts a ruse, and he begins to stack these bales up, doesn't pulp them. A few days later, a Nazi factotum shows up and wonders why all that paper hasn't been pulped yet. And the foreman bluffs and says, oh, that's not your stuff, that's other stuff. We're getting to your stuff first, so that stuff has to wait. And somehow this ruse held up. And as a result, when the war ended, the Allied forces, the Americans actually, who got to Munich from the West, were able to take receipt of all the Nazi Party membership records. And after unification in the early 90s, they were all turned over to the German government, the now reunified Germany, and they sit in this archive in Berlin. So I went in there with a hit list of ancestors of mine. I wanted to know if they'd been Nazi Party members. And the first person I wanted to check out was Wilhelm Merck, who was my dad's uncle, favorite uncle, raced cars, worked in the factory of the Merck pharmaceutical concern in Darmstadt. I'd heard my dad talk about him growing up, but he never mentioned that he'd been a party member. The other person on the list was my dad's stepfather, beloved stepfather, a violinist, an amateur musician, an obstetrician by profession. But while he was not a member of the party, he did something to try to immunize himself and keep his standing with the new regime, which was to become a financial supporter of the SS. And all the paperwork is in the archive in Lichterfelde on Hans Albrecht. Again, something I did not know and was immensely sobering. And then finally, there was an archive north of Berlin that had all sorts of military records. It was a combination of the Allied POW records and then all the Wehrmacht records of German soldiers. And I physically walked in there with a request for my dad's records and was told that there would be a wait of up to 2 years before they could get to my request. And as it happened, about 2 years and 4 or 5 months after I physically submitted that written request, I got an email from Germany. I'd long since come back to Cornwall, and it included one little detail that I'm sure many of you who've done archival research know, that quest for the one little needle in the haystack. I wanted to know where my dad had actually been taken by the Americans. He described it as this village somewhere in Western Germany. He had fled across a town square and then ran into Americans in jeeps and avidly surrendered to them. And of course, that began my dad's journey to becoming an American citizen. And sure enough, in the records that were sent to me, I found out that it was a little town called Wehen, just outside of Wiesbaden. May seem like a tiny little footnote, but to me, after almost 2.5 years, it meant a lot in terms of the circle getting closed. Oh, and then finally, there was an archive here on this side of the ocean at Yale that had a lot of Kurt and Helen Wolff's literary papers. Certainly some of the early papers and correspondence that he had with writers like Kafka back in the teens before World War I, when he was publishing Kafka and Franz Werfel and some of those early expressionist authors. And this is a thing that when you're trying to tell an intimate family story, your heart just leaps when you run across. It's a notebook that served not really as a diary, but just were little fragments of thought and almost therapeutic outbursts would get written down. And the first line here in German is, "Ich bin am späten Abend meines Lebens," which means I'm in the late evening of my life. And you can imagine when you read the beginning of several paragraphs that open with that phrase that you know that there's something valuable there. And of course, it found its way into Endpapers. So my enterprise was running on 2 tracks. I was deep into these personal papers, letters, diaries, talking to cousins over in Germany too, who still had memories of things that my Aunt Maria had told them, memories of my dad. But probably the great enriching experience, the way I spent most of my time when we were in Berlin, was doing the second track, the contextualizing of all of that intimate family stuff by reading in parallel. So what did I read? I read, there's Gunter Grass's memoir up there at the top of the stack. Fritz Stern wrote a wonderful book called 5 Germanys I Have Known. Next one down, Exiled in Paradise by Anthony Heilbutt, which is a history of so many of these artists and intellectuals who wound up fleeing from the continent over to the US. And some of them, like my grandfather and Thomas Mann and Bertolt Brecht, fled back because of all sorts of forces, sometimes McCarthyism, and in my grandfather's case, because he lost a boardroom battle over the future of Pantheon. The next book down is a bio of Varian Fry, this only slightly known hero, an American journalist who went to Marseille and set up this amazing 13-month-long rescue committee office that got some of these people, like my grandparents, my grandfather and step-grandmother, out of Vichy France, as well as artists like Max Ernst and Hannah Arendt, the great philosopher, and Frederick Taylor's book, Exercising Hitler, wonderful history of what it was like in the immediate aftermath of the war. The next book, Blitzed, is about drug abuse among the Nazis, and particularly Hitler, and how drugs produced by Merck, my family's pharmaceutical firm, had actually turned Hitler into a junkie, is what the author argues. Even after he was nearly killed in the famous Valkyrie plot in July of 44, he did have a ruptured eardrum from that episode and was taking cocaine as well as an opioid called Eucadol that in concert had turned him basically into a junkie. Amos Elon's book about German Jewry, a fantastic survey that actually talks about some of those anti-Semitic riots that my ancestors got caught up in. Hitler's Jewish soldiers, my dad was one of maybe 150,000 German men of Jewish descent to some degree or another who actually fought for Hitler. And then probably the most magisterial of all these books is Tim Snyder's Bloodlands, which is about that area of Europe between Hitler and Stalin, pulled back and forth, famines foisted on it, whether it's the Ukraine or Belarus or Poland, by one dictator or another. And it was in that book that I realized probably the most disturbing thing, that my dad, in participating in the invasion of the Soviet Union and occupying Ukraine, was simply by eating his rations, was a party to the hunger plan, which was hatched by Nazis. The idea was to starve Slavs and Jews and Soviet prisoners of war, and have soldiers eat off the land and any surplus be remitted back to the Reich to keep German citizens fat and sassy and supporting the war effort. So all very, very important stuff that threw what I was reading that was personal into a whole new light. So there I am in Germany, and I'm coming back from the Bundesarchiv with all these documents that are in German, and my grandfather's World War I diary, typescripts in German, everything in German. So I did go to the Middlebury College Language School, to the German school, for 3 weeks, just before we went to Berlin. And that scraped about 40 years of rust off my college German, which definitely helped. But I was incredibly lucky that Deborah Cohen, a woman here, lived about 3 blocks from where we lived in Kreuzberg in Berlin. And she's an ABD in history and runs this language school. And I went to her and I said, I'll pay you your hourly language rate, but I need you to be a kind of translation whisperer for me. And she was fabulous. And she has her laptop open up in that picture, which is perfect because she was a magician using the web and going to these obscure thesauri and dictionaries and just finding things that are digitized that would help shed light on a phrase that might have been in, say, my Aunt Maria's letter where she's describing a bombing raid. So this quote here from the Israeli novelist Etgar Keret, that translators are the ninjas of the literary world. Deborah really drove that point home to me. So then I come back. I've done some writing while over in Berlin, although mostly just absorbing the story, doing that reading, that wide-ranging reading. I hadn't sold the book to a publisher yet. I wanted to whip into reasonable shape a few chapters and put together a proposal. And finally, my agent was able to find a house, Grove Atlantic in New York, which is a fairly small press, kind of a boutique house, not one of the big conglomerate houses, where I got a wonderful editor, a guy named Peter Blackstock, who's edited not the most recent Booker Prize winner, but the 2 previous ones, including Shuggie Bain by Douglas Stewart. Speaks 6 languages fluently, including Russian and German, barely 30, just basically a wunderkind. And he and Morgan Entrekin, who runs the house, read some of my early drafts, and they explained, look, you're skipping around in chronology much too much. Yes, a lot of people know a lot about World War II, but people are accustomed to having historical stories delivered to them chronologically. So they said at one point, we thought we could just take what you sent us and cut it into bits and go into our conference room and rearrange all the elements, but we'll let you do all that. So I was sent back to put a nice chronological through line through the whole thing. And those of you who've read the book know that I do step out of the chronology to treat incidents in the present day. There was so much going on in the US and in Germany with Trump and Merkel that was just dredging up a lot of this history of the Nazi catastrophe, and it was impossible to ignore it. And I'm trained as a journalist. I wanted to write journalism and talk about the present day and what I was seeing and what it was like to visit these historical places around Berlin where, you know, a wall will have bullet holes in it, and there's a reason for every one of those bullet holes. And we came to this understanding that you could do that. It will enrich the book. It will tie it to the present. But that you should use Trump and what was going on in the US in the moment as a framing device and not keep returning to it during the course of what is essentially a piece of history, which was wonderful advice. And I think it works. I think readers are alerted at the beginning and are reminded at the end of the book by the framing device that history can repeat itself and that democracy is something that you have to work at, which is something my dad said famously toward the end of his life. But it was a wonderful experience to go through that process with Grove. And I really feel at the end that cuts that were recommended, I don't regret that I had to make any of them. I am very grateful that they basically let me have my complete run of the footnotes. I could stash things back there if I absolutely had to. And then finally, I had worked through the process of working on this book with the working title of Berlin Reckoning. And I just thought that having the word Berlin in there would have so much resonance to it. And I really was trying to come to terms with this. There was so much I was finding out. There'd been so much silence from my dad and his generation that, of course, Germans of my age would be very familiar with. But I needed to convey that somehow in the book and certainly in the title. And then just a few weeks before we went to press, Peter, my brilliant editor, thought that maybe as a way to sort of signal that this is a book about books, that this is a book about a literary figure of some import and the writers that he came in, and painters that he came in contact with, that maybe there's some term out of the publishing world. And he threw out the idea of Endpapers, and I instantly just felt it was right. It just had a kind of classy sound to it. It's one of those words that's made up of two constituent parts that I always love. It works so well with the image on the cover, which is actually a woodcut that Franz Mazarel, this Belgian printmaker, had done for a book that Kurt Wolff himself published. And this figure up there just seems to be discovering something surprising, unsettling, whatever it might be. But the idea of discovery, certainly the era, the early 20th century, is writ large right here with this image. And Endpapers works, I think, even outside of the context of books and book publishing. Endpapers are those things that are pasted to the hardcovers that sort of bind all the paper to the hardcovers. So now, that having been done, the German edition came out a few months ago, and that title translates to Land of My Fathers, and you can see they've highlighted Kurt in the subtitle because he is fairly well known in Germany. Sylvia, you'll be probably intrigued to know that the Spanish edition, which comes out in January, will be called Páginas de Vuelta a Casa, which, please correct me if I have this wrong, but I think more or less means homecoming papers or pages. And there will be a paperback coming out in March in this country. So that was how we got from my dad saying, almost as a throwaway line, maybe you'll write about this someday, and me scribbling kind of from that point on, to holding a book in my hands now in 2 going on 3 languages, which is has been quite the journey. But I'm confident that everybody on this Zoom can share in some of the excitement that I had in working on this. And as a result, I hope you have questions to share too. So Taylor, I'm going to stop my screen share here and throw it back to you.
All right. And Sylvia, do you want to jump in? I see that you've unmuted yourself.
Oh, no. No, I'm so excited that the book is coming out in Spanish. That's fantastic.
Wonderful. I hope you, and please let me know if the translation is up to snuff, because
Okay.
I cannot be the judge of that.
Okay. I will.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Alex. And as we wait for some questions to come in, I will ask one of my own. So this, as I said to you earlier, is an incredibly fitting way to ring in the year of the 50th anniversary of the Sheldon Archives. And the archivist Eva Garcelon-Hart and I are both art historians at heart. So I was curious how visual sources played into your research for this. Seeing your father's amateur photography to me was an incredibly exciting moment. And you just mentioned at the end this woodcut that you chose as your cover. So I'm just curious if visual sources helped fill in any absences in the textual archive.
Yeah, no, they really brought, they fired my imagination. I've always enjoyed, I guess there's a Greek word, ekphrasis. You could correct me on it. But it's basically taking an image and writing to it or writing off it. And it wasn't just all the photos that my dad had taken that had survived the years, but he loved to paint, watercolors, and he brought a little watercolor set with him. And in the book, there's actually a reproduction of one of them. And there's this Italian portrait painter named Felice Casorati who did this portrait of my grandfather in 1928 or 29, shortly before my grandparents got divorced, but when he was sort of on the downslide of his publishing career in Europe. But it captures for me just the refined world in which he operated. You can just see it wasn't just any book that's sitting there in front of him. It's a very finely crafted book with a slip cover and a slip case, and that is absolutely a tailored suit that my grandfather is wearing. And so yes, it was an opportunity to see the story in another dimension, visually, and then try to reverse engineer from some of those images words that would come off the page. Now, some of them were documents, and I've reproduced a few of those too because they can be really spooky. I mean, so many of them have swastikas on them and end in Heil Hitler, and just have that that kind of bureaucratic crackle to them. You can just see it in the typewriter strokes, the keystrokes, and that was part of the mood that I was trying to discover and then somehow reproduce on the page. So yes, it was much more than I thought so going over there. The other arts played a part. I mean, there's a section of the book where I talk about a film that was screened at the Berlin Film Festival when we were there that brought up a lot of the themes of both today and then that have to do with refugees. A film called Transit, and there was a stage adaptation of The Tin Drum that led me to a realization that I write about briefly in the book. So that process of consuming stuff over in Berlin is at play in the pages of the book. It's not all history, just in a recitative fashion.
Great, thank you. And David Pistilli asks, let's see, Alex, was your father interned outside of Wiesbaden or somewhere here in the US? I lived in Wiesbaden in the 1980s.
Yeah, he was taken prisoner outside of Wiesbaden, but then was actually sent back to France to an American POW camp outside Le Mans, where they have the famous 24-hour auto race. And that was safely in the northwest of the country, I believe, is where Le Mans is, and that's where he was. And my dad always described a very harrowing journey back from Le Mans by train to Munich once he was released. And there were these various stopovers where they would be processed. And there was one time I read about in the book where some drunken French soldiers, this is well after the war had ended, they'd been decommissioned, but they still had weapons and recognized there were a bunch of German POWs in this open cattle car and started shooting at it. And Fortunately, somebody got wise and got that train with these French soldiers and their rifles, got it moving before any bloodshed could take place.
Oh my gosh. All right. Not so much a question, but Frankie Yetten says, since denazification was mentioned, I highly recommend a short documentary on Netflix called Camp Confidential about the Nazi scientists who were more or less smuggled into the US.
Wow, and I'm guessing that they wound up in Huntsville, Alabama, the Werner von Braun's and so forth. That's what I guess Frankie is referring to. But yeah, it was the double standards that were at play. And in a geopolitical sense, you can understand why that suddenly everyone turned their attention to the Cold War. And anybody, regardless of a dodgy political past with the Third Reich, who could stay the Soviets, suddenly had a better chance to slip through and might get a second lease on life or have their crimes overlooked. So, and even the Merck Darmstadt, the family company, it's very clear in a history that Merck commissioned for its 350th anniversary just several years ago, no holds barred history they commissioned, admits that if the full extent of Merck's involvement in militarism and the Third Reich in providing rocket fuel and so forth, that if that had been fully known in the immediate aftermath of the war, that the family would have had their business expropriated. And in fact, it stayed with the family. And I have relatives over there who are very prosperous today for that very reason, which is yet another thing to reckon with. I think Frankie has weighed in the chat. Let me just, it was a very secret camp out of DC. Nobody who worked there was ever to speak about it. So that's not Huntsville. Yeah. And okay, and I see Bill Hart has a question. Can you say more about how your grandfather, a non-US citizen, founded Pantheon Books, a major publisher? That question, Bill, is gets at the very crux of the reason my grandfather repatriated himself to Europe. So he becomes an American citizen. He arrives via Lisbon on the Serpa Pinto in March of 1941. And shortly after the war ends, he will become an American citizen because it takes 5 years. But within a year after arriving, he and my step-grandmother have to make a living, and the only thing he knows how to do is to publish. So he starts taking meetings with all sorts of people in the publishing world. He has a few German friends who've been in the States for a long time who give him some advice too, but Warder Norton of W.W. Norton and Alfred Knopf meet with him, give him advice, and he goes and finds some people to invest and gathers up, I think, about $15,000 in investment, including from a cousin of his ex-wife, George W. Merck of the American Mercs, ponied up a little money, just enough to start Pantheon. But the deal is that neither he nor his wife would get paid a salary until the house broke into the black. So Kerr would make trips over to Europe with artwork that he had taken, usually things that he could just roll up and stick in a pocket of a coat. But he would take them back and pawn them over in Europe, or take things from people he found in Europe and take them back and sell them at American art dealers. Always for pennies on the dollar of what they were worth, but enough so that they could survive until Pantheon breaks into the black. And sure enough, they do have a big hit, even while the war's still going on, in a complete edition of Grimm's Fairy Tales, which, in spite of everyone being anti-German, W.H. Auden writes this really positive review on the front page of the Times Book Review, and it becomes this Christmas season bestseller. So they somehow scrimp save and make their way through. But then by the 50s, Pantheon tastes some real success. So Anne Morrow Lindbergh's book, Gift from the Sea, becomes a bestseller. And then the big one is Dr. Zhivago. They're entrusted with it. They publish it in the States. it just becomes this event. And as a result of that, there are board members at Pantheon who are tired of this pokey literary publishing house that Kurt believed in and doesn't understand why we can't have every book we publish have Zhivago potential. So there's this boardroom battle, and Kurt is so defeated by it all, and his health is failing, that he and Helen go to Switzerland, and it's the last 3 or 4 years of their life that they're back in Europe. So it's really a sad tale with a little bit of a redemptive twist at the very end, because shortly before Kurt dies, he's struck by a truck in a tragic end and dies in 1963. But 2 years before that, William Jovanovich of Harcourt Brace offers Helen and Kurt this wonderful deal where they could have their very own imprint within Harcourt and have total autonomy, and nobody would be bean counting behind their backs or anything like that. So they had this great final 2 years of I Told You So, where they actually secured for Harcourt, or actually prior to leaving Pantheon, they secured for Harcourt The Tin Drum by Gunter Grass. And then Grass's second novel, Grass, followed them to Harcourt. And Helen continued to publish books under the imprint Helen and Kurt Wolff Books at Harcourt Brace and then Harcourt Brace Jovanovich for 30 years. So there's a whole second legacy with Helen Wolff after Kurt. I hope that clarifies a little bit there for you, Bill.
All right, well, we don't have any more questions that have come in. So in the interest of not impressing upon your time too much more, Alex, I will hand it back over to Board President Lucinda Cockrell.